Welcome to Max and Lara talking about the topic of the resurrection, which is a really pivotal conversation to be having, especially around Easter. For Christians, the resurrection is a very significant part of our faith, and we're going to be thinking about it in three different ways. So we're going to start off by thinking about the question of whether or not the resurrection was a bodily resurrection, what the early Christians thought, what modern Christians today make of that. We're going to think about evidence, what counts as evidence when looking at this topic. And then lastly, how do people go about interpreting that evidence? So I'm Lara, and I'm interested in this topic from a historical perspective, as well as a spiritual one. I have always found history fascinating, and there's something the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15, which is that basically Christianity either stands or falls on whether or not Jesus did actually resurrect. So I've been interested in that. Max?
Yeah, so I'm a philosophy lecturer, and I'm especially interested in epistemology, that area of philosophy that thinks about questions to do with how much we know about the world, what the question of what is evidence, rationality, how much evidence we need in order to be rational in believing various things. And so it's felt natural for me to be really interested in historical questions about the origins of Christianity and obviously especially the question of the resurrection.
Now, Max, I know that you haven't always been someone who's had a faith. What was your journey from not being someone who wouldn't believe in something like a resurrection to thinking that actually this might be possible, to becoming a Christian?
So I was an agnostic as a teenager, and I hadn't looked into the origins of Christianity in any detail. I think I basically just had an assumption that there wasn't any evidence and that it was on a par with kind of Greek mythology. So, you know, the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, where there's this father and son who make themselves wings out of wax, but they go too close to the sun. I just thought that the resurrection claim was on a par with that kind of stuff. So I just didn't take it at all seriously. So Lara, you have, you know, as you said, thought about these questions for a long time. What were the kind of things that potentially troubled you or stood out to you as you were growing up with respect to this issue?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian environment, and I've thought about it, about, you know, from an early age, what I thought was true or what could be true, and what factors sort of played into that. And I think one that certainly did was just broadly growing up in a country where I think in general South Africa has an influence from a lot of different cultures where spirituality is taken seriously and the supernatural is assumed in a lot of in a lot of places. And I think that impacted the way I saw the world. It didn't seem completely implausible that there was a supernatural world in the kind of general worldview within those cultures in that country. I think also just in my own home, kind of growing up thinking that, I mean, I knew, you know, there's different types of beliefs in the world, and that there's some people who don't believe that there is a God or a kind of supreme being in the universe. But I grew up thinking, well, it's very possible that there might be some kind of creator being. And if that was the case, I think my logic followed the thought that a being that could create the laws of nature could also suspend them and could also do something new, like a new creation if there was a creation in the first place. So I think those are some of the plausibility structures in my mind for something like a resurrection. But I definitely did question that and question whether, just because it might be possible, whether or not that actually was true. What was your journey from not believing to believing?
Yeah, so I encountered when I was sort of 19, 20, Christians who sort of broke my stereotypes and categories of what Christians were like. So I encountered people who were both thoughtful and rigorous, and it seemed to me normal, but also who took the resurrection seriously. And I think that prompted me to look into the case for Christianity, especially the case for the resurrection for myself. And I was really surprised, I guess, to find that there were historians and philosophers at top universities who've argued that there is a substantial evidential case for the resurrection. So people like N.T. Wright, who was at Durham University, Richard Swinburne at Oxford University. And it also seemed to me that, you know, even the agnostic and atheist New Testament scholars who've looked at this topic. So someone like Giza Vermesh, who was at Oxford and who I think is agnostic. He, in his detailed book on the resurrection, looks through all the attempts to explain Jesus' resurrection without appealing to a miracle, and he doesn't think any of them are very good. He just doesn't. He claims not to sort of have an explanation for what happened, but it's clear that he takes the topic seriously enough to devote quite a detailed book to it. So in that sense, it just became clear to me that this is not on a par with Greek myths in that sense.
Right. So it's getting a number of scholars interested, and I was thinking Bart Ehrman as well, dedicating his academic life to these questions, but himself not being a Christian.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, believe in the resurrection. So thinking about this first question of a bodily resurrection of Jesus, I guess we could think about it in two parts. So firstly, what did the early Christians think?
Right.
Is there some sense in which they could have been thinking that, and speaking of the resurrection in a more metaphorical or non-bodily spiritual sense?
Yeah.
Or were they definitely speaking about a bodily resurrection? And then secondly, for Christians today, modern Christians, is the bodily resurrection of Jesus an important question? Yeah, important.
Yeah, so let's take that first one. I think we can be really quite confident historically that the early Christians really did think it was a bodily resurrection. And again, that's separate from the question of what we should think. So how can we be confident about that? Well, in the Second Temple period in Judaism, which is to say the period when the Jews had returned from exile in Babylon to the land of Israel, Palestine.
Rebuilt,
the temple was rebuilt. There seemed to have been a range of afterlife beliefs. And N.T. Wright has documented this quite extensively. But it seems like by the time of Jesus, the predominant belief was in a bodily resurrection of everyone at the end of history on Judgment Day. And this is reflected in some of the burial practices from that time period. So we find that there are lots of these stone boxes containing the bones of the dead from that time period. And it seems like the reason for that is that there was this belief that God would actually raise up the bones on Judgment Day and reclothe them with flesh. So it very much was this corporeal idea. Resurrection was a bodily concept. And so it's against that backdrop that the early Christians, who were all Jews, were making this claim that Jesus had been resurrected. So, and it's really important to emphasize that there were other categories available to them. We know that first century Jews had concepts of, they had concepts of ghosts, they had concepts of people just being kind of taken up into heaven, of angels and so on. So if they had meant something non-physical, there were lots of ways for them to say that.
Yeah, and I guess talking about Paul as well, what he says in that sort of ancient, sort of earliest creed really in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about Jesus being crucified, died, was buried.
Right.
And, I guess that's a really stark...
Yeah, and especially because Paul was a Pharisee, he says that himself, that he was a member of this faction of Judaism where we know that the Pharisees believed in a bodily resurrection at the end of time. We know that from Josephus.
In contradistinction to the Sadducees.
That's right, who didn't believe in any afterlife. So the fact that Paul was a Pharisee and the fact, as you said, that he really wants to emphasize that Jesus died and was buried and then was raised on the third day, it makes it very difficult to see how Paul could have thought that that being raised on the third day didn't involve something happening to Jesus' body.
Right. And then in 1 Corinthians 15:11, Paul explicitly says that he's getting this teaching from the other apostles. And that...
Right, exactly. So, and that's how we can be very confident that this wasn't just Paul's idiosyncratic idea. This was the teaching of all of the apostles.
Yeah. And I guess also going back to that other part in 1 Corinthians 15 that I mentioned earlier, where Paul says that really this is the bedrock of the belief of those early Christians, and that if it didn't happen, then kind of Christians are most to be pitied for believing this, and also the faith is futile. So for him, this resurrection is both true, believes it happened, but also absolutely significant to what they believe.
Right.
Which I guess takes us into that second question of, what does it mean for modern Christians today? Does it matter? I was thinking through that question, and some things that were coming to mind. Firstly, as Paul's saying, this is so crucial. If it didn't happen, kind of the basis for what we believe falls apart. And it's sort of interesting that, and I know we're going to talk about this a bit later, but how we know that the disciples weren't expecting Jesus to resurrect from what they've said, and the evidence seems to suggest that they were really surprised as well. They went sort of theologically. They were actually thinking something else was going to happen. They were really depressed when he died. And so this is a surprise to them. But then they go back and start re-looking at their scriptures, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures like Isaiah 11, Psalm 2, some of these texts. And one, for example, where there's this messianic promise that God makes to David that his seed is going to be raised and raised up. And they start to sort of see this messianic kind of claim that there's going to be some kind of new creation and a resurrection, and they start to see that in their scriptures. And so this becomes actually for them the ultimate fulfillment of everything that had been promised. And then just secondly, another thought, we've often talked about the fact that religion often seems to tend towards this, I guess, ancient Gnostic idea of this dualism of the spiritual, everything of the spiritual is of utmost importance, and then the material world and the body just ends up being kind of really unimportant and not valued. And actually, if this happened, and as Christians could claim God actually resurrects Jesus, and he's the symbol of the first one to be resurrected, and that all people will have this bodily resurrection, then it really sort of dignifies the material world and gives us a theology for caring about this world.
The environment, for example.
The environment, our bodies, this all that's around us, the world that we're living in now. So I guess those are two reasons why this might be significant for a Christian today.
Why modern Christians should care about it being a bodily event.
Yeah. Now moving on to the actual evidence. What sort of evidence are we talking about when we're saying that there is evidence that this is something that people really claimed happened?
So I think we could talk about two broad approaches to this question, minimalist and maximalist. So the minimalist approach, or what's sometimes called the minimal facts approach, hones in on just those historical facts that would be accepted by a nearly unanimous consensus of the relevant ancient historians, biblical scholars, and so on, of all kind of religious or non-religious backgrounds. And so what those facts would basically be that Jesus was crucified, that his followers sincerely thought that they saw the risen Jesus, and that Paul converted from being a persecutor to a follower of Jesus because he thought that Jesus appeared to him. So I think, on the one hand, the advantage of this approach is that it can seem to give a sense of assurance, especially maybe when presenting to someone who's never heard of any of this stuff before, that, it's not some kind of wacky fringe thing. You're actually kind of drawing on a solid consensus of scholarship. The downside, I think, by being so pared back and so kind of minimalist, is that the data set you're left with is quite thin, and it's arguably, it's not clear whether it's strong enough to argue for a bodily resurrection. In fact, and a number of Christian scholars have argued that it's not. And because you can't really say anything about what the appearances were like if you're going with this ultra-minimalist approach. All you can really say is that they were convinced they saw Jesus again, but in what sense isn't clear. And so I think the other thing to say is that you can't, even with this approach, you can't stay in lockstep with scholarly consensus at every step, because the final step, after all, is that inference from the minimal facts to a bodily
something
resurrection.
Spiritual.
Which almost by definition, a non-Christian scholar doesn't accept that final step.
Could happen. Yeah. Okay. So I think if we look at the kind of categories that, if we're going to take a bit more of a maximalist approach, there are three kind of, I guess, evidences that maybe are worth looking at, in a bit more detail. The crucifixion, the empty tomb.
Yes, and the burial, which came before that.
The empty tomb, and then these post-mortem appearances.
Right.
So maybe do you want to start with the Roman evidence for the crucifixion? Okay.
The crucifixion is certainly in terms of ancient history really, really well attested. So it's not just Paul and the Gospels, but there are also a number of non-Christian sources which talk about Jesus' crucifixion. So Josephus, Tacitus, among others. Some actually quite skeptical historians have said things like that the crucifixion is one of the best attested events in ancient history. And it's, I think, also worth emphasizing just how much detail the gospel accounts give of the crucifixion of Jesus. Probably the most detailed account we have from the ancient world of a crucifixion. But how do we know, though, that Jesus actually died? So it's one thing to say he was crucified, and that's very historically well attested. But how do we know that he actually died on that cross? And I think here it's our knowledge from modern medicine of how crucifixion actually kills its victims. That's very important. So, and apologies if this is a little bit gory, but the way that crucifixion kills its victims is by slowly asphyxiating them. So the victim has to pull up really effortfully to take each breath. So it's really visible whether the person is still alive, and eventually they get too tired to keep taking any more breaths. So what that means is the Roman soldiers could very easily verify death. And we also know that they had a number of methods for ensuring death. Things like breaking the legs to hasten death, and also putting spears in the side, which the Gospels actually talk about as the Roman soldiers did that with the two people either side of Jesus, and according to John, the spear in the side.
Some people might say, there's an account of Josephus, for example, appealing to Caesar because he saw some friends of his on the way,
who were being crucified.
Along the side of the road being crucified, and he said, please take them down. And according to the historical accounts, one of them did actually survive, was resuscitated. How would you, could there be any credibility to that happening to Jesus?
I don't think so, because there isn't the faintest suggestion that he was taken down before he had died. So in Josephus' account, his friend was taken down at a point where it was clear he was still alive. And actually, not always was it the case that the victims were flogged heavily before they were crucified. So, and Jesus was, and that again is very well attested. And the intense flogging and the way it would have completely broken up all the flesh on his back and everything would have just meant that, let's just suppose, for hypothetically, that somehow he did manage to survive and then revive in the cool of the tomb. It's such a stretch to suppose that the state he would have been in could have inspired the disciples to believe that he had been resurrected and was the sort of Lord of the world.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with what they then went on to say. Okay, well then I guess the next question would be about the burial itself and the question of, do we know anything about the tomb he was buried in? What, and can that be verified at all? And I think it's probably fair to say, actually, yes, with the archaeological finds, and then matched against the evidence in the gospel accounts, these accounts of what happened, that the location, the site that they mention, and then what they found and what's been, I guess, over the centuries.
And the type of tomb it was as well.
Sorry, the type of tomb, that's right. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre being a kind of very standard and accepted site of
I think that's right. Most archaeologists would say that that's the best candidate.
Another interesting point about that is, historically, there was a time where there was a big question about the accuracy of the accounts, because they clearly state that Jesus was buried outside of the city wall, and actually the tomb that's been venerated,
the site that was claimed by Christians,
was actually inside.
So it's interesting in terms of the location of the tomb, because the Gospels say very clearly that Jesus was buried outside the city walls, and he would have to be in accordance with Jewish law. But the site that Christians had been venerating for hundreds of years as the claimed tomb site was inside the walls of Jerusalem. But actually, what we know is from both archaeology and written sources outside the Bible, the city wall of Jerusalem moved because in 44 AD, so about 14 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Herod Agrippa built a new city wall which was much larger and it encompassed the area where Jesus' tomb site was. So this is really interesting because unless someone was there from the very early stages, they would never have claimed that the tomb was in a place where it was now inside the city walls after the expansion of the walls in 44 AD. So what this does pretty clearly show is that claim about that site goes back to the very earliest years of the Christian movement.
And that leads us on to the next question, though, is this question of the tomb being empty on the day after the Sabbath, on this third day. And the different accounts. I think a part of the story that has always been fascinating to me is that women are named as the first people to be the witnesses of the fact that this tomb is empty.
Right.
And what's so interesting about that is, I mean, so not only it's interesting from a historical perspective, but also just for me as a woman, it's possibly the most important moment in the Christian story, and it's kind of given to women, which is great, at a time when women were not seen as valid. And I think that's what's fascinating about this is that in the accounts themselves, written by these men, a few decades after the event, they named these women as the first witnesses to the resurrection and, well, as we're talking about now, the empty tomb, at least.
And the men are skeptical.
They don't believe them.
Yeah.
So I think just knowing that the women were put forward as these first witnesses is actually in some ways a fascinating evidence, kind of almost counterintuitively for being true, because I think Josephus himself writes that a woman's testimony it's not equal to a man's in a court of law. Rabbinic law says that. So here we have women and the gospel accounts sort of agree on this, that they're the ones to find this empty tomb, and that itself is a kind of interesting point of evidence.
That's right.
If they were making it up, why would they?
Yeah, and and Giza Vermesh, who, as I mentioned, he was an agnostic scholar, and he concluded that the empty tomb was authentic. And the main reason he gives is that if the early Christians were fabricating this, they would have chosen male witnesses. And it seems, if you want to say, well, the male disciples had run away, but fine, but Joseph of Arimathea seems to have been the owner of the tomb, respectable member of the Jewish council. They could have so easily said it was him who found the empty tomb.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating that there isn't any evidence historically of anyone saying, well, actually, no, we do have his body and here it is.
No.
Yeah.
And N.T. Wright makes this point that the evidence of the earliest polemic against the Christians by the Jerusalem authorities presupposed that the tomb was empty. So that the polemic was, well, the disciples stole the body, which the gospel writers felt they had to. Clearly, they felt that was a claim that the opponents of the early Christian movement were making, and we'll talk about that later, whether that's credible. But what's clear is that all of that presupposes that they knew the tomb was empty.
Yeah. Right, so a lot of evidence we can see definitely for the crucifixion, and significant amount of evidence, I would say, for the empty tomb as well, the burial and the empty tomb. The next thing that we really need to discuss and has caused a lot of conversation, and this is, I think, really the point where scholars kind of really get into the nitty-gritty of the argument, is what about these appearance claims?
The appearances.
Do you want to start us off?
So the place that most scholars start on this topic is with that very compressed summary that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, where he he summarizes the events of Jesus' death and burial, but then gives a list of eyewitnesses who believe that they saw the risen Jesus. And it's pretty clear, and most scholars would accept, that Paul knew some of these key eyewitnesses, such as Peter and James. And what's interesting about this summary is that it includes appearances to both individuals like Peter and James, but also to groups of people. So the 12, or even more than 500 people at once. And Paul says, most of those 500 are still alive, though some have still died. And he seems to be implying there that in principle, one could go and talk to those people and ask them what they saw. So I think, if one sticks with the very minimalist approach that we described earlier, that kind of is your data set when it comes to the appearances. So I think the fact that there are some group appearances is significant, and that's going to make it harder for there to be a naturalistic explanation in terms of hallucinations. But still, Paul doesn't say anything really about exactly what those experiences were like. And this is why, as we were discussing earlier, I think the stronger case is going to be one that draws in the gospel narratives which narrate the details of what the disciples saw on those occasions and the robustly physical character of those experiences. And so I think this is why it is going to be important to set this in the context of a broader case for the reliability of the Gospels.
Yeah, and do you want to say a bit about some of those Gospel appearances? And you mentioned they...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, some of the key characteristics of them seem to be that, they have conversation with Jesus for extended periods of time. It's not just some kind of fleeting apparition. But also that Jesus kind of does things like eating with them, inviting them to touch his scars and so on. And interestingly, they don't always recognize Jesus at first, which is a detail I find intriguing in that it's not at all obvious why this would have
included.
It doesn't sort of doesn't seem
bolster a claim.
Doesn't seem to bolster the claim.
Like in Luke, the on the road to Emmaus, the two disciples and Mary Magdalene.
And the way in which this thing happens, where they don't always recognize him at first, and then they recognize him. It's very different in each of the different accounts. So it doesn't obviously look like it's some kind of motif that they were just riffing off and varying it. In each of the different accounts, the way that this failure to recognize and then recognize it is described very differently.
Yeah. So obviously you're saying if we actually want to kind of think more about the detail of these appearances, you do have to do an exploration of the historicity of the Gospels.
I think so.
So that's another thing I guess someone could look into if that's of interest.
We've also got some resources on that.
Yeah. Finally, looking at this question of interpreting the evidence.
Yeah, this third issue that we're going to talk about.
I guess, looking at what are the available options for, explaining the data that we've just been discussing. We touched a bit on this question of could Jesus, sort of known as swoon theory,
right?
Could it be, and there's lots of people in the world who would say that actually, there's a whole group of people I know believes that Jesus didn't die.
Right.
And actually that somehow he was, sort of hidden away somewhere to recover, but that would also then presuppose, I guess, that these other accounts aren't true, that the accounts of the resurrection as they're described here aren't quite as they would have been had it been a swoon sort of, Jesus just sort of appeared to die on the cross.
So it's probably true to say that, in popular culture, the swoon theory might have some currency. I don't think there's really any scholar today who would seriously defend the swoon theory. And I think that's because, well, firstly, the crucifixion is so well attested. And secondly, as we were saying earlier, our understanding of how crucifixion kills its victims is such that it's very clear that the Romans would have been able to certify death. And then of this further point that even if somehow he had survived, the state he would have been in would have been such that it's just very, very far-fetched to imagine that would have been inspiring to the disciples.
Yeah. I mean, there are some claims that Jesus ended up going to Kashmir, I think, and teaching there, but those would be much later. Those any evidence for that claim?
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of claims would appear centuries later, not decades later.
So that's why the historians say that's not a credible
Yeah, I mean, it's common sense that a source is going to be much more credible if it's very close in time to the events than as opposed to centuries.
So then I guess another question that's worth thinking about in terms of how do you interpret this evidence is what's sometimes known as the fraud theory.
Right.
Were the disciples aware that they hadn't actually had these experiences that they are claiming to have had, and that they were just trying to create some kind of power base for themselves, having had their community sort of decimated by this event, and that they just weren't telling the truth.
Yeah, so I think in popular culture, the fraud theory has some currency, but it's actually very hard to find a single scholar who would defend that, just because the sincerity of the disciples is so evident. And we know that some of the key leaders of that early Christian movement were eventually killed for their Christian belief, but also Paul himself in his letters tells us that he violently persecuted the early Christian movement from day one. And so the fact that they were facing danger and even danger of death, I think it doesn't by itself show that what they believed was true, but it does strongly suggest they were sincere.
Right, and there are not a lot of examples in history, I struggle to think of any, where people go to their death knowing that they were defending something that wasn't true. Right, so now perhaps the most popular interpretation of the evidence outside of it actually being a physical resurrection would be some kind of hallucination born of a cognitive dissonance, given that this was such a kind of a strongly held desire for Jesus to be the Messiah, the hero of the story, and the story kind of just came up in legend as a result of that.
I think I would just make two quite simple points about this. So the first thing is that the messianic expectations of the day were such that if your so-called Messiah ended up getting crucified, that was a pretty decisive signal that he wasn't the Messiah. So lots of other messianic claimants in the period, and what happened in all of the other cases is once they were crucified by the Romans, their following just fell apart. And so this would have been a very strong signal that give up on Jesus now. And the other thing to say is, I guess linking with our earlier discussion, the hallucination hypothesis gets less and less traction the more reason we have to take seriously those robustly physical descriptions of the resurrection appearances in the Gospels.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good place for us to wrap things up. A last thought from me, maybe about just looking at this issue, and for anyone who's interested to think, why does this matter so much? Why do Christians kind of put such an emphasis on this Easter story? And I think, for me, thinking about it, there are two things that really stick with me. That if Jesus is this, this really significant person, and this divine being that I guess we think the Gospels are claiming he is, then that says something very profound about God's knowledge, first-hand knowledge of pain and suffering, and that's, for me, one of the biggest objections someone might have to the existence of a good God in this world. So that says something profound, but then also says something profound about the commitment to restoration in every aspect of life.